Hello everyone. We're going to do the notes for the First World War in case you missed it during class. First World War is really seen as the industrialization of warfare and of killing. So, let's look at the world, and remember, the world is pretty well run by Europe. About 7 out of 10 people on planet Earth are either living in Europe or in a European colony or directly under some sort of governmental or military control of a European power. So this is kind of the swan song of European dominance across the planet. We haven't had a war since 1815 that has been a major war in Europe. There have been small ones, but Napoleon was the last one. So what's going to change to upset all this? And this is something you do need to know on your test, and this is called mania. We're going to go over the different components of mania today. We'll do a couple of activities between the notes and the unit exam. So make sure you're familiar with all the various causes that are listed here. Let's start with militarism. Militarism is increasing your armed forces of a nation in order to prepare for war. And militaries like Britain and Germany get into an arms race building large ships, at first armored cruisers, then later battleships. And then the British in the early 20th century built something called the Dreadnought, which is a battleship on steroids. The Germans then match, and many other countries get locked into this idea of building a large military force. They also thought that they understood the other militaries, what they were going to do, their war plans, and the unfortunate thing is all of their understandings are based on previous wars. Most of the plans were different, so it's going to lead to huge numbers of fatalities. The other issue, of course, is the alliance system. The idea of having nations signing treaties and requiring their fellow nations who sign those treaties to back them in a war. Of course, the danger with that, if one small country gets pulled into a conflict, everyone else gets pulled in as well. It might take just a small incident to bring all of Europe into war. That's called foreshadowing. Another issue is what we call nationalism. If you look here at the map of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is on its last legs, you've got up here, you've got Austria, you've got Hungary, today different nations, Bohemia, Moravia, Transylvania, yep, that's a place, Bosnia, Croatia. All of these different places have different cultural backgrounds and beliefs. Within this one country, you've got Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Slovenians, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Italians. That's going to be difficult to overcome. And so nationalism is one of two things. It's extreme pride and devotion in one's country, but it also is looking down upon others, particularly those adversaries, and seeing them as inferior. The other issue with nationalism is within some of these nations, those smaller groups are demanding independence and starting to push hard to get it. Imperialism. As you can see, the map of Africa, it is fairly well colored. Almost all of Africa has been colonized at that point. And so when one country takes over another area to support its economy and status within the world, that's called imperialism. So far, none of these are enough to actually cause World War I. But in 1914, a prince from the Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to be assassinated in Serbia. That will cause Serbia to have war declared on it by Austria-Hungary. Russia, because they have a treaty with Serbia, then declares war on Austria-Hungary, which brings in Germany, which brings in France, so on and so forth. It sucks all of the other nations into this small war. Suddenly that small war is a very large international global event. And make sure you know this for the test. There are the triple entente. It's a French word, so that should give you an idea which side. Britain, France, and Russia for most of the war. 1917, Russia kind of bails. The U.S. comes in to replace it. Triple alliance. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Very early in the war, Italy bails. Almost immediately is replaced with the Ottoman Empire. You guys know it as Turkey today. One thing I wanted to mention about that. Look at the geographic situation of Europe. The Central Powers, the Triple Alliance, are kind of surrounded. That's never a good sign if you're trying to fight a major war. The U.S. is not involved quite yet. It has declared its neutrality. We're still selling to other countries, but we're mostly focused on the Triple Entente, mainly Britain. President Wilson is even reelected in 1916 because he promised to keep us out of the war. But as you can see, the notice that the Imperial German Embassy is published in 1915, Germany will start sinking ships that fly the British flag or any of their allies' flags, and they're warning Americans to steer clear of these ships. The problem is Americans have a very different interpretation of this, and this is going to lead to some real anger coming up in the next couple of months. So once again, make sure you're familiar with mania. Take some time, really get to know it. As we said earlier, the Central Powers, those Allied powers, are kind of stuck right in the middle. The Triple Entente surround them. It's what we call a two-front war. And the idea that the Germans had was, since Russia would take longer to mobilize, Germany would shift the majority of their forces over to their western border with France, take out the French and British forces, and then shift over to fight Russia. That was the idea. Except at the Battle of the Marne, the German forces got stopped about 25 miles away from Paris, and it's going to lead to stalemate. No one's pretty much going to be moving for the next 4 years. It is going to be a tragedy. Instead, the fighting is going to take place in trenches, these long ditches that people tend to hide in for protection. We call it trench warfare. It's going to spread disease. It's going to lead to mass killing. It's a mess. Also a mess during the war is Russia. As I said earlier, they did start the war on the side of the Triple Entente, but in 1917, Russia withdraws from the war because of a revolution. The czars that had ruled Russia for the last 400 years, are pretty well wiped off the map with the Romanovs being executed in 1919. We're going to see the Soviet Union being created. It's a communist nation. As I said, they completely stay out of the war. We're going to see them in World War II. The U.S., as I said, was not too happy about the Germans announcing that they were going to sink ships. And sure enough, in 1915, the British liner Lusitania is sunk by a torpedo. 128 Americans are killed. It outrages Americans. But that is not what brings us into the war. By 1917, Germany is getting a little desperate. They contact Mexico, and in the Zimmerman note, they say if Mexico would declare war on the United States, Germany will help out. Mexico wants no part of it, but the Americans do find out about it, and war fever just spreads across the nation. Wilson really has no choice but to ask for a declaration of war, which Congress almost overwhelmingly grants. The idea that yellow journalism, you can see it talks about the grave crisis is at hand. So we're seeing still this idea of American nationalism and jingoism being swept up by newspaper publishers that see an opportunity to make money. The actual telegram that was encoded, fortunately the British have pretty good cipher experts, so they were able to break it. We went over this in class. You might want to take a minute, pause it, read it. Well, here's the issue. All countries are really relying on propaganda, but the U.S., for the first time, really gets into the game. It's biased information that's used to promote a political view, to persuade the government and the public to believe in a certain way. For example, anti-alcohol movements are going to appear in World War I, and it's going to lead to the end of alcohol for about 13 years with the passage of the 18th Amendment. I'm not going to spend any time playing it, but one of the songs that we did go over in class is called Hunting the Hun. It almost makes it look like it's a game. And so take a couple of minutes, maybe pause it, read through it, and kind of reflect on the idea, what is it that the Germans are being compared to? Not what they're being called, but what are they being compared to? The idea of heavy emotion, trying to use some truth but maybe distorting the facts. One of the problems is at the beginning of the war, the U.S. has 100,000 people in its army. It needs 5 million. So to close that gap, we begin to see the Selective Service Act passed. It's a draft. And in a draft, men are chosen at relative random to join the military whether they want to or not. So we're going to see large numbers of people volunteer, but just as many, if not more people, will be brought into the military without their consent through the draft. Now the home front, what's going on in the U.S. at the time? All Americans can contribute to the war effort. They're called Liberty Bonds. The idea is the U.S. government needs about $30 billion. Now, we get about $10 billion from taxing. We have additional taxes. The 16th Amendment that had allowed for the income tax was just passed. But we still need a lot of money. And if you're a senator, you're not going to get reelected if you keep raising taxes. So they come up with the idea of war bonds. These Liberty bonds are loans that individuals contribute to the government, and that those monies are then paid back with interest. So if I give $100, in a couple of years, I'll get my $100 back, plus maybe $5 or $10. It's an investment. Not only are you showing patriotism, but you're making a financial gain. So big advantage. We then begin to shift more into making weapons, not only for ourselves, but to sell to our allies, women and minorities, because the men are going off to war. We begin to see African Americans moving up north and out west for some factory jobs. Women are beginning to step into those roles, just like they did during the Civil War. I didn't spend a lot of time in this on the notes, but I just want to point out all of the different ways that technology has changed, not only at the beginning of the war, but throughout the war, to allow killing to increase. One machine gunner can replace 50 standard riflemen. Poison gas, aircraft are brand new methods of killing on the battlefield and surveillance. The armored tank is something new, and it really isn't all that effective. But the submarine does cause some consternation, especially with the British. The idea of transporting people via convoy system, lots of ships being protected by naval escort. One thing I really want everyone to remember, World War I used the Industrial Revolution to mass kill the enemy. Keep that in those huge brains of yours. Germany knows the game is up, and they're worried about this as many as 5 million Americans in what we call the American Expeditionary Force to arrive and defeat Germany. So they see the opportunity, especially with food riots in Paris and the surrounding areas, to launch a massive attack, and it almost works. Notice I said almost. Germans stopped, and they begin this final retreat. There will be no more charging after that. Really, by September and October, German efforts to advance are over. They're barely holding out. Something else that was completely unexpected was the epidemic. We're dealing with COVID. They dealt with what's called the Spanish flu. And I showed a video that kind of went over that. If you want to come into my classroom and watch it, that's no big deal. It's about 6 minutes. But it starts where the battlefields are, and then as soldiers are returning home after the end of 1918, they're taking that with them. 28% of the world population will get this within the next 2 years. On November 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the war is essentially over. Germany and the Allies agree to a timeout. It's called an armistice, and now it's time to negotiate. The Allies want to break up Germany. They don't want it in half. They want it in many different parts. But the U.S. disagrees because the U.S., particularly President Wilson, sees an opportunity here to change the landscape of war. He's a progressive, which means he believes that if we create enough organizations and enough laws, we can change society. We can improve it. He brings to the conference at Versailles the 14 points, these list of ideas and suggestions in order to preserve peace, ending colonial rule, and promoting democracy. The big one of the bunch? The League of Nations. It's a Council of Nations that would get together, settle any international disputes, essentially muzzle the dog of war. The Treaty of Versailles is eventually signed. Germany can't have a large military, can have no air force, no submarines. Germany has to pay back for the war, about $55 billion. They have to start doing that in 1919. They finally pay it off in 2012. So, huge debt. Germany has to accept total blame for the war, and they're going to lose a lot of land. I mean, they lose a lot. Take a minute, pause, go through here. This is going to help Hitler taking over Germany in the 1930s. He constantly refers to this peace treaty as crippling Germany and an effort by others in order to destroy this unquestioned destiny of the German people. However, not all countries are happy with the Treaty of Versailles and the idea of the League of Nations. Surprisingly, it's the U.S. that really opposes it. President Wilson loved the idea, but the Constitution requires that 2/3 of the Senate has to ratify or approve this treaty. The senators are looking at the treaty, and they're fearing that if they sign it, U.S. military forces will be sent overseas to fight in battles that the Congress doesn't approve of. So they vote it down. They're completely against it. The League is dead, and the U.S. stays isolationist. I shouldn't say the League is dead. For the U.S., the League is dead. For the world, it's going to limp along for the next 20 years. Any questions, any issues, please make sure you're reading chapter 23 of the textbook or you're coming to see me. Have a great day.